In this New Year's episode of IT SPARC Cast, the Wall Street Journal asks if AI is good or bad for workers. They then answer, yes. China proves that the US Treasury Department is no Fort Knox. And is Microsoft watching your porn at work? Welcome to the IT SPARC Cast. I'm your host, John Barker.
And I'm your host, Lou Schmidt.
It's Friday, January 3rd. Happy New Year.
It's 2025 and we've already broken the year. So that didn't take very long, did it? But let's talk about some of the stuff that goes along with that.
IT SPARC Cast is a digest of the IT news over the last week or two, with insights, opinions, and a little sarcasm from two experts, each with over 20 years of experience working in IT or for IT vendors. And now, the news bites.
Well, let's start this off by talking about an AI study. I have a feeling we're going to be talking about AI quite a bit this year. So this is a lovely way to open the topic. So from the Wall Street Journal, which I think is lovely, we're getting some mainstream coverage here. There was a study done on a materials company that built its own AI tool to help discover materials research, to help discover new materials, and they found something very interesting. And this study was done by MIT's Aidan Toner Rogers, who's a grad student or working on PhD. I'd have to say they probably clinched it here. It shows that there's challenges that are both pessimistic and optimistic views on AI's impact on the workforce. So the number one thing that they found out was that the company built this tool. Nobody's happy with the tool. Nobody's happy. They deployed the tool. Everybody's grumpy. But one of the nets of this thing, there's been a big debate amongst economists and folks at MIT, for example, and others about whether or not this is going to increase what they consider inequity. Will the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, or the smart get smarter and the people who are less smart not accelerate as quickly with these tools? And what they did find out is that was the case. If you are a top researcher, if you were somebody who was regularly publishing new discoveries of materials, this tool was very beneficial, even though you're grumpy about it. If you were somebody who was down in the lower percentage on the discovery, tool didn't help at all. So what are the takeaways from this? Well, Wall Street Journal used the term exacerbate income inequality. This is why we all don't get paid the same. And if everybody thought AI was going to come in and make us all equal, hopefully you're starting to get over that. It's a tool. But they did find if you're good at what you're doing, when you have AI, you'll get better at what you're doing. If you're not as good as what you're doing, it'll have minimal impact.
You know, Lou, this goes along with what we've been talking about all along, where we've been saying over and over again that AI is not going to take your job that somebody using AI might. And I think that there's not a lot really surprising here. You know, whether the income disparity part is, you know, that's a political statement and we'll leave that one alone. But the use of AI, especially for anybody that you would call an information worker, is key to accelerating up your level in that job. So I think that you might also be seeing cases where lower food chain maybe don't see the value of AI or are concerned about AI and not using it. Whereas I use it so often as a tool to help. I don't use it to write for me, but I use it to make notes for me. I use it to help accelerate some mundane tasks for me. And therefore, I can spend more time working on the things that I'm good at and that need my skills. And I think that that's what we're seeing here.
There was an interesting call out in this article. And one of the things that it talked about was that you would put in the way this particular AI, we don't know what company or research area this is. They requested to be anonymous to actually release this information, but you would input the quality of what you wanted that material to be, whether you wanted it to have a certain, Young's modulus or whatever, and then it would put out suggestions on what to look at. The higher performing folks at this doing this research were better at picking the better suggestions. So we're still in a world where understanding what the tool does and outputs matters. It's not gospel. Not every lead it gives you is equally good. So there's still, and I think this is going to be the case for quite a while, that you're going to need to have a certain set of skill and area knowledge to be able to pull the most out of these tools. They're amplifiers. They're not synthesizers.
And we want to hear from you, the listener, on how you use AI and how you think AI can be helpful for any kind of job that you want to talk about, whether that is a more information worker, more research-based, more physical sciences, whatever it might be. How do you think AI can help in your job, and how is it maybe not as helpful as it might be for somebody else?
Or what do you not understand about AI, and what would you like us to look into and explain?
Yeah, absolutely. So send us email at feedback@itsparkcast.com or hit us up on X at IT SPARC Cast.
Speaking of things that are not completely understood, does the US Treasury Department understand data security?
You would think that if there's any department in the US government outside of the military that understood security, it would be the US Treasury Department. And at the top of the show, I mentioned that they were no Fort Knox, which Fort Knox is used as the poster child for security. So it turns out that the US Treasury Department experienced a significant security breach that's been attributed to a Chinese state-sponsored hacker. So this attack, they obtained a key from a tool called Beyond Trust, which allowed them to bypass security measures and remotely access the Treasury workstation. So Beyond Trust is a remote access tool that is used by the Treasury Department and who knows how many other departments in the US government. So Beyond Trust notified the department of this breach on December 8th of 2024, and then it was reported out by The Verge on December 30th. The hacker accessed certain unclassified documents maintained on these compromised workstations. So at this point, we don't believe there's any classified data that's been breached, but we don't actually know that for sure. So the Treasury Department collaborated with cybersecurity and infrastructure security agencies, that's CISA, and the FBI to address this breach, and the compromised Beyond Trust service was deactivated.
So I have a question. How do you take a brand name like Beyond Trust and make it Beyond Trust? Would I trust this?
It's a good point. The idea is that we're so far beyond trust that we're completely trustable, but now are they beyond our trust?
Was this a zero trust network?
It is now. So
we're going to talk about this a little farther down.
We are.
Why we think that this is a challenge. We're still. John and I talk about doing a deep dive on zero trust networking, and Beyond Trust was one of the early players. And I'm like, oops. So it would be very interesting to see what sort of forensics come out of this particular incident.
Yeah, we're going to keep an eye on this, and we'll let you know and see what all data was breached and so forth. But speaking of forensics, what's going on at Tom's Hardware?
Speaking of incidents, so if you've been watching the news, we've seen a lot of news recently on communication and power outages related to subsea cables. Lots of that. It appears to be increasing, and it's really, really difficult to protect along undersea cable. So NATO plans to build satellite links as backups to the undersea cables, and they're going to call it Project Heist. Now, this is interesting to John and I, and hopefully you, because everybody who's watching this that's in the IT space has heard of this miracle thing called routing that was originally come up with for just this reason, right? The original design of ARPANET came from the ability for you to nuke portions, literally nuke portions of the network, and the network would route around it. So apparently NATO is just now discovering routing and is going to put alternate routes on a satellite-based network that they may or may not completely own themselves. It'd be interesting to see if they end up outsourcing a big chunk of this. I think we all know who has the biggest and most powerful um, satellite mesh network out in the world, which would be Starlink. Now, I can hear in my head some of you watching this and going, why would you want to move from a fiber optic trunk to a satellite-based system? Uh, there's some obviously safety and redundancy is the big question, but something that I'd like you to keep an eye on in the future is that A, governments are rediscovering routing, that we're seeing that. They're going back to some of the basics. B, satellite is now becoming very, very viable for heavy bandwidth applications, critical applications. And this is new. It used to be that you had to have something like your own government and your own launch systems, emergency communication systems built for your military. Now you're looking at this as potentially an overlay application of a commercial satellite service. And that is brand new. We now have Starlink up there. We've had Iridium up there before. That was Motorola's slower bandwidth, but definitely globally deployed network that the US government stepped in and helped prop up when they got into financial trouble. And now we're seeing the OneWeb and the equivalents coming from European vendors. So in your business, you should definitely be thinking about this. John, you've got some thoughts on this. What's going on?
Yeah, let's talk about the controversy of whether the bandwidth is enough. And there was a term that I heard earlier this year, well, in early 2024 or late 2023, when we were talking about AI, but the term was, this is the worst it's ever going to be, meaning it's just going to get better from here. And that's true of anything, that it's network infrastructure related. So if we talk about Starlink or the other vendors, Starlink's not the only low Earth orbit data satellite system, but it's obviously the most named brand that we're aware of and the most ubiquitous at this point. But there are other options, and they're just going to get better and better and better. And you were talking about the next generation being able to handle so much more data than what we're seeing now. We're going to be able to see that. Fiber will always increase and get better, but as a redundancy is really important. I follow that for my own backup plans. I follow the 3-2-1 method where it's 3 copies on 2 different mediums and one has to be off site. You want to have redundancy on your network. That's again why routing was invented. And it's, that's what we're doing here. It just seems like a perfectly sane idea to have to start as a backup. And maybe at some point satellite becomes the primary.
I think it's interesting because why did it even make the news? I was doing dial-on backup phone links and ISDN links 25 years ago. This is not new technology. Dial-on demand and weighted route. You can do this with static routes if you know what you're doing and proper probing. So it seems like we always keep coming back to this. Now, it's funny, you were talking about the Generation 3 satellites at Starlink. They have something like 180 terabits worth of capacity per satellite. And I mean, they are flying about 6,600 of these things right now. And they start shoving them up there with Starship, which is the Gen 3 satellite's going to require it. It's bigger, it's heavier, it's going to have the ability to talk directly to cell phones, do all sorts of new cool stuff. 6,600 nodes, 100 terabytes, 180 terabytes per node. That's not chump change, kids. That's real.
No, bandwidth. I mean, and there are some obvious limitations on per antenna, per device throughput, but you can, eventually get to the point where we're clustering those, and there's all kinds of things that we can be smart about how we get around this. So I think that this really does make sense.
I think it really does, and I think we're going to see a lot more of this. It's about time we really thought back to the basics and stop being so proprietary and start looking at ways to actually distribute the risk for critical stuff. Speaking of things that are a little risky, can you talk about what's up with Microsoft and AI?
Yes. So again, another article from The Verge. By now, we all know that Microsoft has announced and introduced its new AI feature called Recall on Windows 11. This is designed to enhance user productivity by capturing screenshots along the way and creating a database of what websites you're going to, what your email looks like, and things like that, so that you can go back and ask questions. What was that email thread that I was talking to Lou about the next episode of the podcast? And it can bring you that information. The concerns are, and we're seeing a lot of pushback. Part of it was because Microsoft announced it and said it was an opt out. First of all, there was no way to turn it off. Then it was an opt out instead of opt in. And there's lots of things there. And a lot of other concerns. So there was privacy concerns. Is it going to record things I don't want it to record? Is that information going to be available to Microsoft? Are they going to be able to go look at my screenshots? Is there a potential for somebody to break in and get access to it? And then we did see late last year there was a case where somebody was able to get into the database and find actual data on you. You need physical access to the machine in that case, but that's just the first access, the first vulnerability that was found. And then the bigger one, I think, just boils down to just user trust with Microsoft. And Lou and I were talking about this in the pre-show as we were getting ready for this. And I think that's the crux of this, because Apple has been looking at your email and your web history and the files on your computer so that you can do an index search across your desktop forever. And it's really powerful. And it's going to get more powerful as they introduce more Apple Intelligence features. And nobody's complaining about this, at least not in any kind of volume. But
we are definitely not hearing a lot of noise. The other interesting thing is Google's been doing this for a while. People are grumping about it. They have much more data on you than Microsoft does.
I'll give you my own personal anecdote on Google. Is the key ethos at Google early on, the number one corporate rule was don't be evil. And they've actually removed that from their corporate. If you go to the website, you don't find that anymore. And I don't think that Google is evil or intentionally trying to be evil. So that's not my claim there. But I think that they realize that some of their activities will be perceived by some as being evil corporate greed, and that they're using you as a data source that they then resell.
Or even that they helped out military. There's been kerfluffles about that in all of the AI spaces. That's a challenge. So everybody, the idea of don't be evil works fantastic when everybody has the same definition.
Correct.
But as we know, there's a lot of groups in there. Apple seems to have a higher trust basis.
And honestly, I think that comes from a couple of different places. I think that comes from the fact that Apple has actively promoted that your data is not an asset for them to monetize. They won't say this, but their goal is to get you to buy as much expensive hardware, software, and services as possible, but they're not going to monetize your data.
Well,
you could argue whether you believe them or not, but the majority of Apple users and Apple fanboys do believe that.
And it's going through their infrastructure. They want you to buy it through them. They make money if you buy the stuff through them. With Google, they make money on an ad infrastructure that is built. If you haven't read Byron Tao's Means of Control, highly recommend you get that book and check it out. Google and Apple and all the people that built these ad systems I do not believe they started out building this thing to make the ultimate surveillance tool. but that's what
Right.
they did. They
Right.
did. And if you have Apple product, if you carry around an iPhone and an iPad, it's on there too.
Google and
So
Alphabet make almost nothing on Android sales. So the sale of a
it's
device, they make
true.
something like 75 cents per unit on selling Android devices. They make their money on ad revenue and user data
That is
monetization.
absolutely true. And if you want to
It,
come back to the heart of what we're talking about here, do you trust Microsoft to keep this data safe?
and that goes to the fact that Microsoft has changed from a kind of an Apple model of being a hardware, software, and services company to a database, a user data company. You can get Windows for free. I got Windows running on a machine over there that's not registered. It just runs. You can, their goal here is to monetize your data. And I think that people see that, and that's why they're worried about this. And they're maybe worried about security because Microsoft's not known as being the most secure company out there. So I
But
think
on
that
the
there's a
other
lot of things
hand,
that are
you and I discussed the potential for what could happen if somebody could come up with something like this that could follow your life. It would have to
right.
be on your mobile devices. It would have to be on your portal. It'd have to be ubiquitous. But imagine walking down the street as you aged, running into somebody that you haven't seen in 3 years, and having something pop up in AR, your little heads up display, saying, "Oh, that's your friend. You haven't talked to them. You've been meaning to talk to them again. So last time you talked about, they sent you an email about getting together and maybe you didn't respond yet." That, both John and I have been dealing with senior care, and memory issues are always a thing. Now, imagine if your memory starts to have challenges, and as you age, it will. That's
Yep.
just, the way it works. You had a co-pilot that could narrate your life. I mean, I would choose Morgan Freeman's voice to do that, by the way. So somebody, Morgan Freeman's going to be doing my life. But so the promise here is incredible. The question is trust.
It is trust. And
How are we
I
going to
think you're
do
going to
this?
find a lot of people that do trust and a lot of people that don't. But with that, as we're talking about trust, let's get to the CVE of the week.
Of the week. We're going to be talking about a bunch of security stuff, but I'm going to lean a little away from the CVE here and talk about root causes. And that's because we've seen some stuff recently that I think is worth paying attention to, no matter where you are. If you're in your home, if you're in an IT office, corporate office, if you're in government, this is especially applicable to you. And that is old stuff. So we have a lot of activity going on right around government efficiency right now. We have a new administration coming in, and there's been a concerted push for a more efficient government. One of the individuals working on that is Elon Musk, who is in no way controversial at all. Nobody ever has an issue with him. But he posted a very interesting post on X recently where he complained about the fact that they're going through and auditing the US government and they're finding an awful lot of really obsolete hardware. I mean, I'm not just talking about 3 to 5 years old, I'm talking 20 years old. So when we talked about the exploit against the US Treasury, um, you shouldn't be surprised by that. These folks are in what I would call a special support bucket. They're not out of support. If I'm the US government and I'm contracting to Microsoft and I'm still using baseline Pentium 1 computers, you're going to support me. It's going to cost money, but you're going to support me. Guarantee it. So, but the problem is newer machines have better trust infrastructures, have better software compatibility with next generation technologies like the AI that we're talking about. Also, we've had some changes in the way we're sourcing equipment. There's that links into this. We've talked about TP-Link having breaches before. TP-Link is now coming as a focal point in a lot of breaches, especially breaches against the US government. So they're talking about outlawing them completely from government purchases, and they may outlaw them completely in North America. Why? Because this stuff is porous as Swiss cheese, and it's quite probably designed to be that way by the country it comes from. Remember, when a lot of these systems were purchased, we didn't have that adversarial relationship. Now we do. We're seeing a lot of hacks come from that place. So once again, I'm going to start out the new year by entreating you: go find the old stuff, come up with a plan to replace it. I don't care if it's working great. That's the biggest problem. I have been to businesses where this is great. I'll go back to my Cisco days. I guarantee you there are still Catalyst 5000s in production. Guarantee it. The biggest problem I had when I worked for Cisco when the 6500 came out, which I think, by the way, is peak modular chassis. I have never seen a better one. Fantastic device. How do you get that out? Right? It's now obsolete. How do you get rid of that? How did you get a 6500 in if the 5500 was working great? So the rationale you got to use, even if it's still working, is when is it going to break? And what are you going to do about it?
To Lou's point, so many of the customers that I've dealt with in the past have had so much old gear. When I was in high school, I contracted with a government agency that it was called Defense Communications Agency. They handled satellites. So on the top of the roof of the building I worked on was the most advanced equipment you could possibly imagine. And inside the offices was super antiquated, these old chairs from the 50s, really old terminals, all this like old stuff, helping to manage the most complicated systems that the government had at the time. And that's true today. This is just the way governments work.
I've got an even better one. I used to work at a national lab, and I did power conversion. So a Stanford Linear Accelerator, which is how I got in early on the World Wide Web. That's another story. I came down the gallery once, 2 mile long building. There was a piece of power analytics going on a power supply. There was a $50,000 digital capture system on that power supply looking for faults, and an aluminum chair they probably pulled from the Navy surplus. What was chained up? The chair. So that should tell you a lot about, in the days ahead, we're going to hear about them, what they want to cut, but we're also going to hear about what they want to spend money on. And you really need to pay attention to that, because if they're going to spend money on new systems, and we know there's still IBM minis out there, there's still mainframes out there. This stuff is old. A lot of government inefficiency is because they can't put a new process in place. So we're going to be spending money. Take that look at what you're doing and think about that.
Absolutely. 100%.
That's all we ask. It's really going to increase your security posture. It's going to help you a lot.
And that's going to cover this week's episode. We couldn't do podcasts like this without listeners like you. We would love to hear what you think. What's your take on AI helping information workers and other office workers with their job? What's your take on what's the oldest piece of gear that you have seen running on a network or in a facility? We want to hear those types of stories. That would be great. You have any other topics you want us to cover? Send email to feedback@itsparkcast.com. That's feedback at itsparkcast.com, or hit us up on X at IT SPARCcast. Be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. That's really going to help this channel grow. Tell your friends and colleagues about us. If you feel like you're getting great information from us, please let them get that same great information. We'll talk to you next week. Thanks for listening.
See you next time.